Yeah,
Okay. Hi.
I'm turning it over to Phyllis.
Okay. I just want to say that Doug said to me that he'll give his talk, and then I told him that you're the moderator and that so the questions that people will ask, you will handle. Okay.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Doug. It's nice to
Thank
see
you.
you.
Nice to see you too.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, friends and newcomers, to our special conversations with special people. Today, we have a most wonderful and special person, Doug Simon. Doug is Professor Emeritus of Political Science from Drew University. He's an author, a popular lecturer, and he has spoken at our library twice a year since 1988. I mean, and it was coffee and cookies, right? And then you didn't even eat the cookies sometimes, you were in a rush. And I was so happy that you were kind enough to speak here today on Zoom on the state of international relations. I know there's nothing to say about it, but you'll do your best. There's so much going on. And all through the years, you have given us we called it the World Political Update. And you shared your knowledge on what is happening everywhere in the world. I was always so amazed that you knew so much about so many different countries and how the United States fit into it. There's so much going on now, and I can't wait to hear your talk. So please, let's give a warm welcome. I'll clap. And for those who can't, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our very special friend and guest, Doug Simon.
Thank you very much. I want to say it's a pleasure to be here, but that doesn't quite work. It's a pleasure to see you and listen to you through our new technology. I'd much rather meet you as a group, but the circumstances don't really allow us to do that. The topic for today that I've chosen is the state of international relations and U.S. foreign policy. And it's pretty wide open. And I planned it that way to emphasize, frankly, a question and answer period and some discussion. After all, as Phyllis said, this is billed as a conversation group. So I warned her, and she was fine with it, that I'd like to make a few introductory remarks, perhaps 10, 15 minutes at the absolute most, and then throw it open for questions and discussion. And the topic is broad enough that you can ask anything you like. I won't guarantee I have good answers, but I will try. There are many places I could start this thing, but I think 1990 is perhaps the most appropriate. It was the year of the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. George H.W. Bush, who was the president at the time, heralded it as a new world order that was going to emerge in this post-Cold War period. It was to be an era of globalization, of interdependence, of economic integration, international cooperation, and above all, peace. The U.S., of course, was the only superpower left standing after the Cold War. And its leadership was to be as important now as ever. And the evidence of that was the first war with Iraq, which was to counter the blatant aggression of Iraq against the small country of Kuwait. President Bush engineered the UN Security Council to vote to support the operation and marshaled a really substantial coalition of countries to confront Saddam Hussein. The New World Order would also see greater investment in both regional and global international organizations. The UN and its vast network of institutions like the World Health Organization, the United Nations Development Program, the World Court, and so forth. And it all seemed to start out pretty well in the beginning. The economy was pretty much humming along. In fact, under President Clinton, it grew. But then we had the devastating economic crash in 2008. The crash's impact reverberated throughout the world, the global community. But for us, it was essentially a self-inflicted, domestic-based wound. At its heart, I think, were selfish, greedy home mortgage and banking practices that never should have been tolerated. In the long run, I suspect that it hurt our international reputation, our standing as a responsible leader. And before long, things really began to fall apart. In 2011, of course, we had the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and it garnered a lot of sympathy, understanding, and cooperation around the world. But as the years went by, the war in Afghanistan, which we had launched to go after the Al-Qaeda training camps, turned into a seemingly endless slog. And we are now about to leave Afghanistan with the prospect of the Taliban taking over. Iraq took us off course, and that war, of course, turned into a nightmare and ultimately a win, a political win for Iran. The fact is, America's judgment was seriously being questioned. We also began to increasingly hear stories about the negative effects of globalization. First, there was the flight of manufacturing and the loss of jobs. A few years ago, about 3 years ago, maybe 4, my wife and I took a road trip into Western Pennsylvania. She's a genealogist, pretty avid genealogist, and wanted to do some work in the towns of Western Pennsylvania. And one of those was Newcastle. And when we got there and drove around a little bit, there were two things we noticed. One was the proliferation of dollar stores, or the equivalent. And these were all fairly new. They were all over the place. And we took a trip through town. We were driving through town towards the southern edge. And all of a sudden on the right, this enormous building loomed up. It was sheet metal construction, had a few windows in it, had an extremely large parking lot, which was completely grown over with weeds and grass and I don't know what else. Some of the windows were broken. The building was enormous. I mean, multi-football fields large. As it turned out, it was the steel mill, which had been such a critical part of the economy of Newcastle, Pennsylvania, and had been shut down. I had read, obviously, about the impact of globalization and the flight of manufacturing and steel and so forth. But this was my first tangible look at the Rust Belt and what was happening. A second thing happened right about the same time. The military, U.S. military, became increasingly concerned about the outsourcing of so much of the production of our spare parts for weapon systems, which potentially threatened our state of readiness. We used to manufacture everything from top to bottom. Every weapon system was made in the United States. That is no longer true. We have a lot of stuff that is imported from overseas. And third, I believe the COVID-19 pandemic has reinforced this realization that we've outsourced so much overseas. In this case, critical pharmaceuticals, and in some cases, health delivery system equipment. Now, capping all of these developments, we had the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And let's just put aside a lot of the personal nonsense, you know, all the Twitters and so forth. Internationally, he has pursued a policy of a one-man wrecking crew against about every aspect of internationalism. He does not like or trust international organizations and complicated multilateral agreements. He feels that they are a drain on the US in terms of resources and money. He has gone after long-standing international organizations like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and newer arrangements like the Paris Agreement on climate change and the Pacific Trade Agreement. And he has both criticized and ridiculed many of our closest allies. To be honest, what bothers me most is that these policies and these practices threaten international cooperation. Cooperation necessary to address truly transnational problems like climate change, pandemics, terrorism, as well as the sharing of intelligence, well thought out trade policies, and strategic cooperation. I think our leadership judgment has been severely questioned, as our reputation as the can-do country. That if there's a problem, the Americans will always find a way to fix it. Now, I hesitate to predict where all of this is going. A lot obviously will depend on the outcome of the November election. If Trump is reelected, I think America's role in the world and the way she is perceived will continue to deteriorate. But even, and this is important, even if Joe Biden is elected, there is no guarantee that our reputation for sound judgment will improve dramatically. Think about it for a minute. The tragedy of Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, the 2008 economic crash, all of these preceded Donald Trump, and both Democrats and Republicans were in charge. So my concern really goes beyond the next election. I think we have a leadership problem in this country, and that includes not only the White House, but both houses of Congress. And over the past 3 decades, it has had a profoundly negative impact on our global standing. Now, to make matters even worse, we have become a terribly fractured country, and the divisions are very clear. In addition to our historic racial divide, which has become very evident in the last few days, we have an increasing economic division between the have and the have-nots, a cultural divide that seems to grow worse by the day, a geographical divide with largely Democratic liberal concentrations along the West Coast and from Washington to Boston on the East Coast, and a more Republican conservative stream running down through the Great Farm Belt into the South. The existence of these divisions make coming together for the purpose of compromise more and more difficult. And one of the foreign policy problems we face is that in the international system, the country can only speak with one voice. We cannot have multiple voices representing the country in the global arena. The domestic political realm speaks with many voices, and that is appropriate, certainly, for a democracy. But internationally, we should speak with only one voice to make our positions crystal clear to both friend and foe alike. That is increasingly difficult when we are so divided. I am sorry that my message today is so depressing. You may well disagree with some or even all of what I have said, but I think it is important to first sort out what is reality, and second, to honestly confront it, no matter how discouraging it may be. And with that, I would like to close and open up the floor, the electronic or digital floor, for any questions or comments you may have. Thank you.
That was wonderful. When you sized up our problems.
Actually,
I rehearsed this. I went over this with my wife, and her shoulders just shrunk, and she said, "Boy, that's depressing."
I'm going to ask the first question, and after that, you all formulate your questions, and you are muted now, and don't ever take that personally. And I'll unmute everybody, and we'll leave it open, and I'll call on people if there's a lot of people who aren't getting a question in. But I want to ask if there are certain things that you've thought about that are like sort of must-do things, like the speaking with one voice internationally. Are there other concrete things that might possibly happen that would raise our status or enable us to work internationally again?
Well, that's a really good question. I guess I suppose the one thing that troubles me most is our retrenchment, if you will, from the international system and its norms. We're not the only country that's got problems. Most countries in the world have problems of one sort or another, and some are quite severe. And not all countries are exactly friendly to us. They're hostile. They may provide a threat. But I think we have to do a much better job of navigating in that environment. I think that we have, for too long, practiced a foreign policy that is absolutely laced with hubris. The feelings that I think they probably go back to both World War I and World War II. That we're the most powerful country in the world, therefore we have some degree of omnipotence, that we can do anything. And it's not just a question of getting away with something, it's we can do just about anything, correct any problem, solve any problem. And if anything, the last 3 or 4 decades has proven that is not the case. We're not omnipotent. And I think the sooner we begin to realize that, the better off we can be. Now, that is not an excuse for isolationism and withdrawal, but I think we have to be much more careful in the way we navigate the international system, be willing to compromise. I also think that somehow the divisions that are within this country right now, which I outlined in this short talk, we've got to find some way of bridging those divisions. That is absolutely critical. They are not only dysfunctional, they're becoming even more dysfunctional as every day goes by. Positions are hardened, and that makes compromise very, very difficult. I don't know how you come up with a unified voice internationally when you have those kinds of divisions, particularly as they get worse. Is there an optimistic side? Yeah, I think there is. One of the things since the last election, which to me was very heartening, is the number of people, particularly suburban people, suburban women, who have become politicized, politically active in huge numbers across virtually every suburban environment in the United States. It's almost as if there's a generational shift. They tend to be younger, and when I say younger, I mean, certainly in their 40s and younger. And that to me is heartening, that there is this level of politicization and concern about the political system. And I think that's a good thing, and that may be optimistic for the future, but we'll just have to see. I think the bottom line right now, particularly, hopefully after we get ourselves out of this pandemic and economic crisis that we're in, which I think is going to take a while, by the way. I think the bridging of those divisions is absolutely critical, because I think it's hurting us both domestically and internationally. I don't know if I answered your question, but I tried.
Thank you very much. Now,
Sure.
I just unmuted everybody, so if you have a question, just speak out. Say, I have a question, and then whoever's voice we hear gets to go. So is there someone who has a follow-up question?
I have a question, but I was waiting for other people to do it.
That's okay. They're still formulating. Go ahead, Phyllis.
China. I just have to use the same word that Trump puts on his Twitter. How did they steal our garment industry? How did they take so much away from us so willingly? And now can we get it back because of?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I think it's important to recognize that our relationship with China is very complicated. It is not simple at all. We are China's biggest trading partner. So we are valuable to them, okay? But at the same time, they are attempting to take over, establish, if you will, and control a sphere of influence along the Pacific Rim, all the way down through the East China Sea, down into the South China Sea, Southeast Asia. And South China Sea, they've been for some time been deploying military equipment, naval, constructing man-made islands in the South China Sea with radar and missile sites on them and so forth. And they are clearly designating that as a sphere of influence. And they really don't want us there and interfering. And that creates a real problem, because there's major trade routes that go through the South China Sea. So there are both positive and negative things in our relationship with our economic relationship in addressing specifically what Phyllis raised is complicated too. The Chinese have practiced, what shall we say, digital warfare with us, stealing technology, copyrights and so forth, trademarks, intellectual property for some time, well over a decade and a half. And they're quite efficient at it, to be honest with you. And we really haven't solved that problem. We've confronted the Chinese with it, but trying to solve the problem is extremely difficult. But we have, in our own way, aided and abetted this process as well. In order to gain an economic foothold in China, this new growing, exploding economy, we have made concessions. Corporations
I'm going to be on this.
concessions.
This is a lecture I'm listening to, so I won't be the lecture for half an hour.
Mute.
I'll see you later.
In sharing technology as a prerequisite for operating in China. Okay, so in some respects, we have aided and abetted this process of their intellectual property acquisitions. To put it bluntly, it's both been illegal and legal, and that's how it happened. One thing I didn't say about the globalization business, of which the transfer of technology and manufacturing to China is certainly part. I'm not against globalization. I just think we did a terrible job of it. I think a certain amount of globalization is inevitable. I think some of it is very functional. I don't object to it, but I think we allowed it to happen in a very ramshackle way, undisciplined, no guidelines. We just let corporations wholesale pick up and move their facilities to China. And I think that was a big mistake. I think that the first thing we should have done, and I don't know the legal ramifications of this, but I think provision somehow should have been made that for any major manufacturer who wanted to move to China or to Vietnam, for that matter, a certain percentage of the manufacturing must be retained back here in the United States. Okay, I think that is really important. But we didn't do that. Now, there were a few companies that did. 3M Corporation, for instance, they did retain a certain amount of manufacturing here in this country, but a lot of them didn't. They just picked up wholesale and left, and got the cheaper labor and a new market over there and so forth. And I think using the tax code, tax methods are another way of encouraging manufacturing to stay here, or at least a percentage of it to stay in the United States rather than going off someplace else.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, you're all open, so speak up if you have a question.
I'd like to say something. I've been listening to the Dalai Lama on podcast, and he says that this is not a national crisis, but a crisis for humanity. And he said, he's very careful about what he said about our president, but he said, when our president first came into power, when he said, America first, it made him very uncomfortable, because we really do have to work things out together. What do you think about that?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. There's a real, how can I say, there's a real nationalist or nation-centered phenomena that's occurring around the world. It's not just Donald Trump. We see it in England. We see it in Hungary. We certainly see it in Brazil. Leaders that have come to power that emphasize, as the president does, their country first, period. That's it. And have little regard, very little regard for internationalism and global, even regional problem solving for that matter. And I think that is very dangerous, because we're confronted with so many problems that are not national problems. They're what I call transnational problems. Climate change is probably the most dramatic. I mean, everybody's concentrating on the COVID-19 crisis right now, which is obviously transnational, and needs international, some international direction and cooperation. But climate change is extraordinarily serious. We see manifestations of it all over the place now, in all different parts of the world. And if we do nothing and just worry about ourselves and ignore it, we're going to pay a very heavy price down the line. So I think the Dalai Lama is absolutely correct. We have got to I think we have to get out of this syndrome of thinking ourselves as the greatest country in the world. We can do whatever we want. We can solve any problem by ourselves. That is just sheer nonsense. Sheer nonsense.
This is Nan. I'm not trying to be funny, but what do we do really in the interim before the election to make some of these things happen?
You know, I'm great at defining problems and terrible at solving them. I think that's one of the plagues of some academics, and I'm part of that. I don't know. I mean, I think that the only thing the only panacea I could offer is one I am sure you have heard over and over and over again, and that's to become first politically educated and conscious, and then politically active, to the extent that you can. And I think that's the bet. There's no magic bullet here. There's nothing that's going to solve these problems of the divisions in this country and so forth overnight. There just isn't. And I think it's going to take a lot of hard work and communication and political action. And that's why this ray of light that I see in virtually every lot of communities. I know Madison has got a political action group, which is 99% suburban housewives, and it is amazing what they have done. And if you look at the surrounding areas, Parsippany and Chatham and Morristown, and they've all got these political action groups that really formed after the 2016 election. And a lot of these people had never been politically active before, and or to any extent. And they are now, and you know, they're in it up to their necks and working very hard. And I'm optimistic about that, but it's a lot of hard work. It's not something you can just turn around. You're looking in the political environment. You're also subject to a lot of events and developments over which you have no control. Pandemic, we had no control over that. We have some control over a response to something like that. But in terms of the advent of the pandemic, we have no control over that whatsoever. And, you know, so I think, again, just to be knowledgeable, politically knowledgeable about some of these issues and be willing to put some work in with any number of thousands of groups that are politically active.
No, I also think I'm all for the let women take over. But I think on one level, just language checking ourselves. Maybe now I'm sounding so much like a librarian, but to admit the complexity of all the issues that affect globalization, and not say, well, China did this because, as Doug pointed out, you know, our tax policy encourages our corporations to outsource. So I think in daily life, it's so easy to have an assumption from which you're speaking that simplifies things beyond the point at which they should be simplified. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm a great believer in complexity, and I think all these issues that we're talking about are terribly complex. And one of the pitfalls, I think, one of the dangers of politics is the tendency to oversimplify. And you know, the whole business of jingoism and whatnot, it's just ridiculous. And people buy into it because they can comprehend the simple explanations, the catchphrases, the slang, and so forth. And I think that's very dangerous. But it is a slippery slope, because I'll be very honest with you. I think one of the problems that the Democrats have faced in this country is that most of them, higher up Democrats, are policy wonks, okay? They are forever explaining the intricacies of these policies, either the ones they criticize or the ones that they propose. And people's eyes just glass over. And the Democrats lose those people, or they just don't pay much attention, or it goes in one ear and out the other. Republicans, on the other hand, and I'm overgeneralizing, but Republicans have been great messengers. I mean, they can simplify a message down to 10 words, repeat it 10,000 times, and people will start believing it. And they are past masters at that. And that's one of the dangers, it seems to me, of the political environment, is how do you strike that compromise where you can make things simple and comprehensible to people, but at the same time make it nuanced with some understanding of its complexity. And that's, to me, one of the great challenges of the political system that we live in.
Very true.
I just want to make a comment.
This is Sandy.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say that I have seen this wonderful speaker at the library numerous times, and I love history. I love his speech. So again, I want to thank him, and I found it very interesting.
Thank you.
Today. And of course, I want to thank Phyllis, Melissa, and Michael for having this for us. And I wish everyone a good weekend and to be well and safe. I'm not ending it, but I just thought I'd get in there.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Sandy. I have a question for you. Are you ready to run for office?
Oh, now I'll have to change my campaign manager. We'll talk, Melissa. I'm a very behind-the-scenes person, but I'm always there for the library.
That you certainly are.
Thank you.
Melissa?
Yeah?
One other question for Doug. I'm concerned about the leaders in the world because a few of them are the leader that we have now. Is there any leader that you could think of that could be upstanding and that is not a dictator like Putin and?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's two that stand out, and they stand out because, among other things, not only their effectiveness and their articulateness and their common sense reasoning, but they're both women. And that's Angela Merkel in Germany and the Prime Minister of New Zealand, whose name escapes me right now. They are marvelous. Angela Merkel's not perfect. I think that she made a mistake in handling the immigration situation from the Syrian civil war, when all the refugees were plunging in from Syria. And as tragic as that was, I think it was a mistake opening up the borders the way that she did. And I think it cost her politically, among other things. And I think it could have been much better thought out, a rational way, a systematic way of handling the refugees. But you know, no leader is perfect. But those two leaders certainly stand out to me. She will not be in office much longer. She will be out, and there will be a new leader in Germany. But I'm very impressed, as many other people are, with both of them. I don't want. This is not a partisan comment, but I think domestically we have somebody that's not running for president that, frankly, I wish he was, and that was Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York. Now, Andrew Cuomo is not perfect. He is not terribly well liked in some of the political circles in Albany, but I will tell you, he was master class when he first started his press conferences on the COVID-19 issue. His clarity, his common sense, his bending over backwards to tell the truth, to not misinform, not to exaggerate, and to make firm decisions was absolutely first rate. The first time I saw that first press conference, and I just said, wow. I immediately got on Facebook and wrote a piece on that because I just thought it was amazing. I think Governor Inslee in the state of Washington and the governor of California both have acquitted themselves well in this crisis. All three of those, and Governor Murphy, frankly, in New Jersey as well. All four of them were in very bad shape. The COVID-19 virus hit all four of their states very hard, as we all know. But I think that as leaders, as governors of their states, they handled themselves very well. But I think internationally,
Never mind.
Merkel and the New Zealand Prime Minister stand out. I'm still not sure about Macron in France. He basically wants to take Merkel's place, certainly as the leader in Europe and so forth. I just don't know whether he's up to it or not. I don't dislike him, but I'm just not so sure. He's got some political baggage, but in response to your question, I would say those two women really stand out.
That's great.
If you're talking about women too, there's the governor of Michigan who's been
Yeah.
impressive
Yeah.
and walking a very divided state. Gretchen Whitmer, something along those lines.
Yeah. I consider myself, oh God, I want to say a feminist, a male feminist to some extent, and I'm very supportive of women's causes and women's rights and so forth. One of the things I would caution people against, however, is the notion that with gender comes some exceptional competence. Women can be just as prone to bad leadership as men can. Several of the more famous, Indira Gandhi comes to mind,
Eva Peron.
Golda Meir, they were powerful leaders, and there was one other two that slipped on. They all ended up in war. I mean, everybody says, maybe it's the mother instinct. They tend towards more nurturing, and would be great advocates for peace. Yeah, okay, but the record also indicates when women get in power, some of them can be just as prone. And in fact, Hillary Clinton was, I'm not saying she was a war hawk, but she was very militant militarily, quite willing to militarily intervene around the world. So that's no guarantee. But I do think that women being, for so many decades, centuries actually, shut out of the political process with very little access to leadership positions was not only wrong, it was a terrible waste of brain power. And I think anything we can do to encourage that, to expand that pool of political leadership is a good thing.
Yeah. I'm listening. I've got Doug Simon. Yes. You're going to miss the whole thing, Shirley. Yeah.
Shirley.
Does anyone else have a question?
Oh.
Clara, go ahead.
No, it's not a question. I just looked up the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern.
Yeah.
She's also good looking.
No comment.
Actually, I have a question. Do you see any way that we can mend some of the issues at home? Because I'm not sure we can play with the big boys until we've dealt with some, and they are so profound and so systemic that it seems hard to figure how you could even begin to repair.
Yeah, you stated it in your question. I mean, you have to have a firm base before you can venture out. Well, not before you can venture out, but you have to be on solid ground when you go into the international system, and we have so many major domestic problems, and they are systemic and they're deep. I won't say that I have nightmares, but I wake up with anxiety attacks sometimes when I think about the culture wars and the political divisions between the far right and the left in this country, and how those positions have hardened. Sometimes when you reflect back, you tend to exaggerate the good and minimize the bad. And the political environment in this country in the 1950s was not all good. On racial grounds, it was terrible. But there was a kind of a tacit code. It wasn't written, but it was a tacit code within the halls of Congress, in both the House and in the Senate, that there was a willingness to see and define a problem, and then the Republicans and Democratic leadership would get together and say, okay, we have this problem. It somehow needs to be addressed. And we know that we have different ways of addressing the problems. Can we find some common ground to try to move on this? That is not happening now. It is not happening now. There are very few cases where you find that. Usually it comes out of crisis, you know, the stimulus program trying to economically assist businesses and individual families and so forth during the COVID crisis is a good example. But in the 50s, you had it as almost routine, and now it is only during times of extraordinary stress and pressure that the Republicans and Democrats sit down and seek out common areas and come up with legislation that compromises. And that is a tremendous loss. I don't know how we get over that, to be honest with you. I don't know how we get over that. I'm really at a loss. I think one of the things that's happened, and I say this, I think pretty objectively. I'm not trying to gang up on the Republicans, but I think the Republicans, once they seized power, the more conservative elements seized power in Washington, both the White House and particularly, well, both houses of Congress until the last midterm election. They jealously guarded that, and their positions hardened. The Republican positions hardened, and Democrats were shut out. And you know, I just don't think that's a good practice, regardless of which political party is in control. The essence of democracy is negotiation and compromise, and I don't see it right now. And I think it's not only regrettable, I think it's dangerous. There are consequences to that, and they're not good.
I have a question. I understand your perspective with regard to the fact that there is very limited cooperation between political parties these days. And when you noted there will be consequences and they aren't good, what consequences would you foresee potentially happening to our nation if we continue along this road where our lawmakers are not working and coordinating together to solve major problems that exist within our society now?
Yeah, good question. Well, in first place, I want to put a caveat in this. I'm not a specialist at all in domestic politics. I'm an observer, obviously, but foreign policy and international relations is my forte. That, however, will not stop me from trying to answer the question.
Thank you.
never at a loss for words, right? I'll give you one example. The infrastructure in this country is falling apart. Dams are breaking, bridges are falling down, roads are erupting, and there's a lot of talk about doing something about it. And I think people are going to die. People will die because we are neglecting this problem and not getting together and solving this problem. I will tell you another one that is even worse and much bigger, and that is the health delivery system and the health insurance system. This administration came in with the notion of taking the Affordable Care Act apart and putting something else better in place. If I heard that once, I heard it 100 times during the campaign. There hasn't been one even remotely viable proposition from the Republican Party, which seeks to take the Affordable Care Act apart, effectively destroy it, and put a plan in place or propose a plan. And that to me is unconscionable, absolutely unconscionable. I don't care whether you're talking about fixing the Affordable Care Act, which does need some fixing, whether you're talking about a national health plan like Britain has, whether you're talking about doing something to manipulate the private healthcare system we have right now with the insurance companies. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I have my own personal preferences, but from a national perspective, I don't know. But I don't see anything happening here. Maybe, just maybe, the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the unintended consequences will be a realization, a national realization, that the national health delivery system and insurance system needs desperate attention. I would hope so, but you never know. You never know. But those are two, the infrastructure and the health delivery system, where this kind of conflict, this gridlock, this hardening of positions, this lack of compromise has consequences.
I actually have another question. I actually came to the call late. I was on a call until 12:30 with my university. And you may have touched on this from an international perspective. Given the unrest that we are currently experiencing in today's world right now with regard to racial inequities in our country, to what extent is that impacting our position as well as the perception of our democracy around the world, and what are the repercussions of that?
That's a really good question. Well, I don't think there's a single position that other countries have taken. Two things. One is that there are a number of countries and regions of the world that do not have good records on racial relations within their own countries. And when I was in Vietnam for a year back in the 60s, I saw this. Southeast Asia, in some respects, is terribly racist. We saw this recently in Malaysia with the Rohingyas. But so I think those countries just generally just keep their mouth shut. They don't say anything and they don't really care. There are other countries that look at the United States and really call us hypocrites because we're constantly telling other people what to do in terms of human rights, and yet we have situations like we had in Minneapolis over the last few days, and many, many other disproportionate police actions against particularly Black Americans. So that, in that sense, it does hurt us. How damaging it really is, it's hard to say. I just don't know. I don't think it helps us. And particularly when we tout ourselves not only as a democracy, but a democracy which values human rights. And we certainly do. If you go into John Locke, if you go into the Declaration of Independence that Locke was so influential, his ideas are really reflected very powerfully in the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution and so forth. The emphasis on individual rights, the emphasis on freedom and so forth is very, very evident. Now, it is true that during this whole period, the period of the foundation and up to certainly the Civil War with slavery, there was a certain hypocrisy there. It was not equal. It was not only equal in terms of black citizens in this country, but women as well who couldn't vote for almost 200 years, couldn't own property, and so forth. But the emphasis and the constant preaching on the part of figures out of Washington in terms of human rights in the face of our deteriorating or chronic problems with race relations doesn't help matters any.
Yeah, Phyllis, you need to end us here on a cheerful note.
Well, first, Doug, I know a few months ago when I asked you to speak and you were supposed to speak, and we canceled it because it was like the first week that everything stopped.
Yep.
And you were saying to me in a very nice way, after all these years, after all the times you spoke, Phyllis, I think I'm going to stop giving lectures, but I'll give you this last one. And I hate the fact that you said that to me because you were so wonderful and I learned so much from you. And I'm hoping you might change your mind and in the fall, you'll come back.
Well, we'll see.
Okay. Oh,
We'll see.
I like that one.
You're my favorite audience.
Well, thank you. You're wonderful. What a
Okay.
speaker. Thank you again. You and Susan and your family, you should be healthy and happy. And all of you, I wish you a good week and good health and happiness. And I hope you'll come back next Friday, 1 o'clock.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.